So I'm going to be talking to you today about how we can be, I suppose, creating space for Mātauranga Māori to exist in our secondary school programs. Before we get into that, I just want to, I suppose, give a current survey of the climate from my perspective as a teacher before I go over something called a Lifeworthy Context, which is basically what I think could be the key to how we can create space for other knowledge systems like Mātauranga Māori in each of our learning areas. So here's what I see in terms of what's coming out in the media. We have a Prime Minister who last year has set a goal for New Zealand to be in top 10 in PISA by 2033. Our Minister of Education has paused the NCEA Curriculum Change Programme in place for a knowledge-rich curriculum. And supporting that knowledge-rich curriculum is the stuff called the science of learning. In addition to all three of these things, as a teacher, our PLD priorities also cover literacy and numeracy, culturally sustaining pedagogy, and stuff like knowing our learners as well. It kind of feels like we're being pulled in all sorts of different directions. If I'm feeling that, certainly as senior leaders, you probably feel that pressure as well. Now, as for me, I grew up in Auckland. I moved to Auckland when I was 10 months old. Lived in Mount Roskill, did all my education and training there. First school I taught at was Mount Roskill Grammar. One day, I ran to the top of Mount Eden, looked out over the horizon and realised my teacher's salary couldn't afford a single thing to the horizon. So I left Auckland and went to teach at Pāpāmoa College. Today, I find myself teaching at Pāpāmoa College. I live with my partner, Vicky, who's also a science teacher at neighbouring Mātauranga College. And together, we've got a doggy called Toast. He's an 8-year-old golden retriever. Ko Lian Soh toka ingoa. What I'm going to share with you today, I suppose, in terms of how we can create space for Mātauranga Māori, I was kind of thinking to myself, how am I going to offer some ideas that would be useful for a senior leader at your school? I've got just 2 steps for how you can include Mātauranga Māori in your learning areas. Step 1, choosing something called a life-worthy context, something that has heaps of opportunity and action. Opportunity referring to something which frequently appears in a student's life now and also in the future. Action in terms of, I suppose, what can students do with their learning and skills now, and also what can they do with that learning and skill later? Now, some contexts are better than others. So in addition to that, context should also be rich in insight and also rich in ethics. Insight referring to that deeper learning. So thinking about, say, how different concepts can map together from year 9 all the way to year 13. Ethics as in, how can I use what I'm learning in not just my personal life, but also how my decisions might affect others. And when we have a context which is rich in ethics, that is where we open the door to allow Mātauranga Māori to exist, at least in my opinion anyway. Now, in terms of where that word life-worthy has come from, it has come from education literature. Look up a guy called David Perkins. In terms of where can I find a list of life-worthy contexts? Well, remember that fellow at the first slide who has set a goal for top 10 in PISA? Well, it turns out one of the supporting documents for the 2025 PISA Science Framework has a little cheat sheet with all these contexts as identified by 38 OECD countries as being highly relevant to people today, but also in the future. Now, if you're sitting there as a non-science teacher and you're looking at some of these and you're thinking, far out, I'm pretty sure we do some of these in social studies, or far out, we've looked at some of these texts or films in English, which is relevant. All of these contexts are massive. They're social, eco-geopolitical issues. They need a multidisciplinary approach to solve. So they don't just belong in any single one discipline. Now, that's pretty cool because when we think about stuff like the science of learning, it essentially means that if you have the same context across different subjects, then you can basically kind of do some of that UDL stuff, multiple forms of expression as kids move out throughout their timetable. At the same time, when these kids move through that timetable, it also allows teachers to ask questions like, where have we seen stuff like this before? That all, I suppose, starts linking into that science of learning stuff. So I put another reading in there from Linda Darling-Hammond, which has that science of learning stuff in there, just in case you're interested. Now, in terms of, Lian, do you have an example of a life-worthy context? So yes, let's have a look at biodiversity. When I started my role at Pāpāmoa College, I kind of ran this little experiment where I'll try to teach a context around predator-free 2050. One of the first things which I asked the students, and you're looking at slides which I show my students, I asked these students, what is the name of this bird? And students will tell me, Mr. Soh, that is a fantail. Excellent. I then asked them for the name and te reo, and they can tell me things like, that is a piwakawaka. And then I'm like, great. What about some other names? Only one student in my 2.5 years here has been able to tell me that there are actually a whole variety of other names, depending on dialect, for this bird. Now, in terms of how can we achieve mana orite, if we think about where these names have come from, it's quite probable that piwakawaka, piwaka, all these words have come from the te reo name, the te reo word, ti takataka, which means fitting about. Now, when Pākehā first arrived in Aotearoa, they called this bird the flycatcher. So in terms of mana orite, we have two different cultures who have both made an observation about this bird, and they've both named this bird based on their observations. Two entirely different cultures, two entirely different knowledge systems. Turns out this sort of, looking at the etymologies of names and also words applies to a lot of our native species as well, but also to other concepts in science. So I've looked it up as well, but even words like electron, proton, and neutron, you can actually use like an etymology approach to help achieve mana orite. Now, this is just pretty surface level stuff, but I guess what I'm trying to say is that there is a lot of Mātauranga which is embedded in the language, which I admit that I myself cannot access because I am not fluent in te reo. But I suppose for staff that are new to your school or new to the profession, this is probably something you can get them started on. In terms of life-worthy contexts, we're giving kids a bunch of skills and experiences which match up with what's going on in real life. So a couple of pictures here. Kids are doing stuff with tracking tunnels. Those tracking tunnels are the same tracking tunnels that we use out in the bush in New Zealand today. The way in which they gather and interpret data is exactly the same way that we do it in the bush. The tools which they use to analyze bite marks of different pests are the same tools that we also use out in the bush as well. If you choose a life-worthy context, it is something that is so big that it also invites the opportunity for numeracy activities to exist in your learning program as well. Now, here are those 4 words again, and here is a screenshot of that reading from David Perkins. For something to be considered a life-worthy context, it has to be rich in opportunity, insight, action, and ethics. So opportunity, does this context regularly occur? Insight, does this context provide deeper learning? Action, what can students do with this information and skill now and later? And ethics, how is this socially relevant? Looking at insight we've mentioned before is how we can start hitting, I think at least, some of that knowledge-rich curriculum stuff, and potentially also some of that science of learning as well. In terms of a knowledge-rich curriculum, by the time we choose a context, if we can backwards map all the concepts that are relevant from year 9 to year 13, but also, I suppose, when we're teaching these contexts, draw upon the students' library of experiences from when they've gone through primary school, then we can start hitting some of that knowledge-rich curriculum stuff. If we give these students a mind map of all how these different concepts relate to each other within, I suppose, a subject or across different subjects in a timetable, turns out that in terms of science of learning, providing students with some sort of mind map or cognitive map helps them connect ideas together to a more meaningful whole. So we can tie our learning to a big context. In terms of ethics, which answers the original question, which kind of addresses the brief which Jane kind of put out to me in the first place. How do we include Mātauranga Māori in our learning program? In terms of ethics, how is this socially relevant? We can learn a lot from Mātauranga Māori. Science can learn a lot from other knowledge systems. Science is really great at teaching us about concepts. It's great at teaching us about problems in the world. It's great at teaching us about solutions. It's not very good when it teaches us how to implement some of those solutions. So there's a little webinar which just went up on Science Learning Hub about 1.5-ish weeks ago. But in terms of some of the stuff that's coming out in that webinar, essentially what we're trying to say is that knowledge systems outside of science often carry ways of implementing solutions. It carries with it values and lessons on how to interact with others and how to implement some science ideas, some of those science-informed responses. Now, when it comes to something like Predator-Free 2050, one trend which I notice, which is quite common in students when you first touch upon this topic, is that by the time you get close to the end of that topic, there's students out there that are super keen to get out and they're just like, oh yeah, let's just kill all the pests, or oh, we should just 1080 drop just about everything. But how, I suppose, from Mātauranga Māori, we can learn that actually there's a more human element to this. So there is pūrākau out there, which one such example is Rongomawi stole some kumara tubers from his older brother Whānui. Now, you can imagine that Whānui probably wasn't too impressed by this. In fact, he was quite angry. And so Whānui unleashed upon the earth a whole bunch of different insects that would forever feed upon the kumara vines. Now, why would we be talking about pūrākau in a context like Predator Free 2050? Because actually the lesson here isn't, oh, let's just get all the pests. The lesson here is actually that pests are here as a consequence of human action. And so maybe instead of just addressing the pests, we should also be addressing some of our behaviors as people. In terms of Mātauranga Māori, we can also learn ways of working together. So for example, the science tells us that eliminating mice and rats is probably going to do wonders for our biodiversity. However, in terms of working together, if you just went around and did that, there's going to be some groups that aren't going to be impressed with you. So there are some groups out there who see themselves as kaitiaki of the Kiore because they played such an important role in history for Māori in that area. I also want to leave with you 4 readings, and these 4 readings you can kind of look up, and I can see Jane smiling because there's one there which she lent me, Decolonising Methodologies. However, the one I want to look at is this one in red, A Guide to Vision Mātauranga. Now, this is something that's more related to science, but there's one quote in there which I think is super applicable to us as, I suppose, leaders in our school. So here it is. It's from Sir Mason Jury. We've heard a lot already today about increasing the number of scientists who are Māori. The other question is, do we have Māori who are scientists? You might want to ponder that possibility for a while. Between the two of them, there's an interface. And where are you in the spectrum? The point is, you are both. The difficulty is, when do you employ each? When is it better to look for a Mātauranga Māori approach, and when do you look for a science approach? Remembering that you are somewhere at the interface and you've got to juggle both because you can't really integrate them. Now, as a teacher, when I read a quote like that, I'm thinking, this basically tells me that actually in terms of working with other knowledge systems, it's not about pigeonholing it into a science program. It's actually about trying to build this awareness in our students so that in the future, when they enter the research space or whatever industry they're in, they know when to draw upon science and they know when to draw upon Mātauranga Māori. When is it okay and when is it not okay? And if I start looking at, say, what's out there currently online for Te Mātai Aho, I notice that from phase 3 to phase 5, we're starting to build values, dispositions, and key competencies in our students. Stuff like being empathetic and resilient, stuff like developing agency, stuff like working with and others and advocating for them as well. So in terms of, Lian, how do we include Mātauranga Māori, or how do we create space for Mātauranga Māori to exist? It starts with a massive context. One thing I did forget to mention is that when you choose a big context, yes, it creates room for numeracy. It also creates room for literacy as well. So I happen to have copies of the 2022 pilot literacy assessment, so things might be different now. But here are all the topics from the reading and the writing exam. Highlighted in purple now are those same topics which overlap from that cheat sheet of context from that PISA document. Maybe just something to think about. In terms of when you choose a great context, we've said that if your context is rich in ethics, it opens the door for Mātauranga Māori to exist. So going through those steps again, choose a great context. Choosing a context rich in ethics means you can create space for Mātauranga Māori to exist. Choosing a context which is rich in insight means that you can map out all these different concepts across year levels, but also invites opportunities for literacy and numeracy to exist as well. When you have all of these things and you provide students with some sort of mind map and also work on teacher pedagogy, then that starts covering some of that science of learning stuff. So yes, biodiversity, great context. But instead of a topic, say like plants, why not look at something like how we grow and gather our food? I recently found out that if the world ate the average New Zealand diet and produced food according to the average New Zealand farm, we would need a whole other 1.5 Earths to sustain that population. That basically tells us what we're doing now isn't going to last forever. So we need to be teaching about that. In terms of looking at forces, motion, and energy, why not we look at why we need energy in the first place? Who uses energy? Instead of looking at the human body, why not we look at personal and population health? Instead of looking at geology, why not we start looking at climate change and other natural disasters? When we do that, we invite the door for other knowledge systems to exist because these are big problems that need solving. So I will also leave with you, I suppose, in this recording, a couple of slides that you can flick over to also rewatch at your own pace. But I'm also sharing with you a couple of tips that worked for me when I was looking at Mātauranga Māori, and a couple of things which didn't work when I was looking at Mātauranga Māori. There's also a couple of slides here, which I can refer to during question time if you're interested. But other than that, that kind of ends the kōrero, which I wish to share with you today.